all research contributions, including outstanding interest of critical universities. She has contributed to data schemes and credentials and particular interest for public. She has also worked on the knowledge tools and their applications. So, very good to say that an evolution of models of the knowledge tools, and after a round of words, the floor is yours, and thanks a lot for coming here. Thanks.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay if I stand here?
Not yet.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me? I'm just going to hold the mic then. I'm quite small, so if I just stand behind this thing, no one will see me, which is a little awkward. So hi, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. I also want to say a big thank you to the chairs and the program committee for inviting me. It was really quite an honor. So as Francois Xavier has said, this talk is, if I can get my slides going, this talk is really going to focus on zero-knowledge proofs from a very applied cryptographic perspective. I'm going to be looking at the applications of zero-knowledge proofs, the enormous amount of effort this community has put into making zero-knowledge proofs really practical, like as practical as we can get them. And I'm going to look at how sort of modeling has enabled that shift by sort of moving away from the kind of traditional view of things to views that actually enable more efficient proofs and more practical proofs. So if modeling is not your thing, I know it's not for everyone. If you are really interested in the techniques, I'm not going to go into those. My hope is that that will make the talk quite accessible, even for people who don't work in this field. So I view that as a positive thing. If you are interested in sort of more of the details, though, I encourage you to check out, first of all, zkproof.org. This is a standardization effort that is a really active community. They run workshops every spring for the past bunch of years now. And conveniently, Jens Groth also gave a really excellent invited talk earlier this year at Crypto, all about zero knowledge, but really much more focused on the techniques, like how do we do it. I thought I would also just briefly introduce myself, since of course most of you don't know me at all. So I'm a professor, as Francois Xavier said, at University College London. I'm also more recently a researcher at Google. I have these really sort of quite long-standing research interests in both privacy and I guess more recently sort of transparency and the kind of intersection between the two, how we can achieve both at the same time. This has sort of led to looking a lot at cryptocurrencies, both from the kind of cryptographic constructive angle, but also doing sort of empirical analyses to see how well they achieve their privacy and transparency goals. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm going to sort of move on to the star of the show here, which is, of course, zero knowledge. So very briefly, so in a zero knowledge proof, a prover wants to basically convince some verifier of the validity of an instance. Basically, they want to convince them that some instance X is a member of some, usually NP hard language L. And this is sort of equivalent to showing the existence of some witness for the statement that XW is in the NP hard relation corresponding to that language. So here we can see the prover represented by this parrot, and the verifier represented by this vulture. And we can see that the prover takes in the instance and the witness, they output some proof, and the verifier takes in this instance and the proof, and they either accept the proof saying, yes, I'm now convinced that this instance is in the language, or they reject it. So this particular setup is what we call a non-interactive zero-knowledge proof, right? So there's one message from the prover to the verifier, no further interaction. And intuitively, there are two main security properties we want a zero-knowledge proof to satisfy. And these are soundness, which says that if the instance X is actually not in the language, then it should be really hard for a malicious prover to form a proof of that verifies. So it should be hard for them to convince the verifier of essentially a false statement. And then we also want them to satisfy zero knowledge, which basically says that in deciding if this instance is in the language or not, the verifier should learn nothing else. They should only learn that the instance is in the language. And in particular, they really shouldn't learn anything about the witness. Okay, so of course, it's always good to demonstrate these things with an example. So I've picked my sort of favorite example over the past couple of years. I don't remember where I saw it first, but the example I'm going to use is that of Where's Waldo? So I hope everyone is familiar with Where's Waldo. The idea is you get a crowded page, there's a bunch of stuff happening, and you're looking for a guy. He's wearing like a red and white striped top. I wish I were getting more nods so I wouldn't just be explaining how Where's Waldo works, but I am hoping you all know it. And so we can think of, if we want to represent this in this sort of setup that I've given, we can think of the instance as the sort of page in the book here. And then we can think of the witness as being the coordinates of where on this page Waldo is located. So how do we do this in ZeroKnowledge? So we can think of having the book, having the page, and then what we do is we construct a screen that is essentially twice the size of each of the dimensions. So it's twice as wide as the book and it's twice as high as the book. And the important property of this screen is basically that it is opaque. You can't see through it. So you can think of this as being cardboard or, you know, pick your favorite opaque material. So the idea is the prover and the verifier are in a room together, and they sort of have this screen in the room. And now the prover is, the verifier can check, you know, that the prover doesn't have anything on them except for the book. And then the prover sort of goes behind the screen. They can cut a little hole in the middle of the screen. And the prover holds up the book so that what appears in that little hole in the middle of the screen is Waldo. Okay, so the verifier can see for themselves if this is Waldo or not in this hole in the screen, right? So I claim that this proof is sound, because there's really no way for the prover to convince the verifier if they didn't actually know where Waldo was to hold up the book in the right place. And equally, I claim that this proof is ZeroKnowledge. And that's because of how big the screen is, right? So if we think about where the book is in relation to the screen, well, it could be here, and Waldo could be in like the very, very top right of the page, or it could be here. And basically, the book could be anywhere behind this screen. We have no idea. And so all options are equally likely. And so basically, the verifier genuinely gets no information about the coordinates at which Waldo appears. Okay, so hopefully that sort of makes sense. And what I want to do now is just give a little more detail about what the definitions here actually look like. After all, this is a talk about sort of modeling, and some aspects of these definitions will come up again and again later in the talk. So the first thing I want to talk about is how do we actually define ZeroKnowledge? So, you know, in cryptography, we have a number of ways where we can try to capture that, you know, someone shouldn't learn something. So what does that look like for ZeroKnowledge? So before I get there, there's a really important part of non-interactive ZeroKnowledge that I've left out, which is this idea of a common reference string. So this sort of adds another algorithm. We have a setup algorithm now that generates this common reference string. And this common reference string needs to be available to both the prover and the verifier. And this is actually known that we can't do non-interactive ZeroKnowledge without such a common reference string. And so a natural question that we might ask ourselves, certainly given where the rest of this talk is going to go, is what does this common reference string look like and how does it get generated? So one option is the common reference string is just uniformly random. And in that case, we can say that it is generated in a trustless way, or we have a trustless setup. Otherwise, we could have that the common reference string needs to have some kind of algebraic structure that basically allows us to actually form these proofs. And in that case, we say that the setup is trusted. Equally, the common reference string can be sort of specific to a given relation. It can allow you to prove sort of only one type of thing, or it can be what we call universal, meaning you can use it to prove any relation, or at least a very sort of very broad classes of relations. Okay, so again, this is an inherent part of non-interactive ZeroKnowledge proofs and will definitely be important later in the talk. So for now, let's go back to ZeroKnowledge. So in ZeroKnowledge, we're considering basically a malicious verifier who wants to learn more about, who wants to learn information about the witness. And that's sort of what we're trying to prevent. So in the sort of real world, we have the verifier interacting with this, the honest prover who does know the witness. And we're also going to consider a simulated world where the verifier instead interacts with a simulator that actually doesn't know the witness. And so somehow, despite not knowing the witness, the simulator is going to need to be able to produce valid proofs. So obviously, with no other information, this is not possible. This would violate soundness. And so what we're going to do is we're going to allow the simulator to also create the common reference string. And in doing that, to create a sort of simulation trapdoor. And the simulator can then use that trapdoor in generating these proofs. And then basically ZeroKnowledge holds if the verifier can't tell who they're interacting with, the prover who does know the witness or the simulator who has no idea of what the witness is. And intuitively, this sort of captures the fact that if the verifier can't tell, they sort of can't learn anything about the witness because they don't even know if the person they're interacting with has one or not. And we have sort of one variant here, which is perfect ZeroKnowledge, which says that the distributions of these interactions are not only indistinguishable, but they're actually identical. All right, so the last thing I want to sort of define or revisit is this idea that there exists a witness. So this is basically what soundness captures. The prover is convincing the verifier of the existence of a witness. Excuse me, but sometimes it's quite useful to have a stronger requirement. So if you think about where's Waldo, the prover was convincing the verifier not just that, oh, Waldo is somewhere here on the page, but that actually I know where Waldo is on the page, right? That otherwise the prover could have never sort of held up the book in the right way. So this idea of knowing the witness is what we call a proof of knowledge. And we can also consider this property as extractability. So why is it called that? So now we're considering a malicious prover who basically wants to convince the verifier of something false or something where it doesn't actually know the witness. And the idea is that we should be able to have an extractor that from any verifying proof is able to output a witness for that instance. So again, the way I've written it, it's completely not okay. This would violate ZeroKnowledge. So we do exactly the same trick that we did with the simulator, where basically the extractor can generate the reference string. They can also, in that process, output a trapdoor that then allows them to perform this extraction. And so the idea is that, again, in the real world, no one would have this ability, and so ZeroKnowledge would be preserved. So again, in terms of sort of variance here, if this extractor exists and works for all polynomial time provers, then we call this an argument of knowledge. And if this holds for all provers, potentially unbounded ones, then we call this a proof of knowledge. Okay, so far for, I guess, a lot of you in the room, I probably haven't said anything too new, but I just sort of wanted to summarize, where things were at after, let's say, the first sort of 20 years of ZeroKnowledge. And now that we've got a lot of the definitions, we're all on the same page about those, I want to start considering the efficiency of these ZeroKnowledge proofs. So for a long time, ZeroKnowledge proofs were not efficient. This was kind of feasibility. So they involved, really expensive reductions to kind of classical like NP-complete problems. And if we talk about the efficiency of these proofs, we can think across really three dimensions. We can think about the prover runtime. How long does it take the prover to generate a proof? We can think about the size of the proof. I should say I'm going to do all of these things relative to the size of the witness. So we can think about the size of the proof relative to the size of the witness. And then finally, we can think of the verifier runtime. How long does it take to run verification? So for a long time, even when we had sort of more practical constructions of ZeroKnowledge proofs, except for this one sort of feasibility argument by Killian, the sort of state of the art in all algebraic settings was linear. Everything was linear. So the prover runtime was linear in the size of the witness, the proof size was linear in the size of the witness, and the verifier runtime, which I guess you can imagine applied to the size of the proof, was also linear in the size of the witness. So this all sort of changed with a kind of, I guess, breakthrough result by Jens Groth in 2009, in which he showed how to construct a succinct non-interactive argument, I think it's just an argument, and then later follow up with arguments of knowledge. And this is abbreviated a snark or a snarg. And so the real sort of breakthrough here was that these were actually practical proofs whose size, the size of the proof was actually sublinear in the size of the witness. And so that's what makes these proofs succinct. All right, so I'm going to kind of stop my sort of history of zero-knowledge proofs there for now. And I'm going to talk about another technology that was being developed at the same time. And this is the idea of a blockchain. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the details. In fact, I'm going to go into almost no details of how blockchains work. And I should say that everything I'm presenting, for those of you who are familiar with blockchains, I'd encourage you to think of this not just as about blockchains, but really about any system in which we want a set of participants to agree on a shared state, because ultimately that's all the blockchain really is a mechanism to do that. So for those of you who maybe don't have any knowledge of what this is, it's not very complicated. It is literally what it sounds like. It is a chain of blocks. And what is each block? Well, it's basically just a list of transactions. And those transactions can represent pretty much anything. But I think for this talk, it's easiest to stick with the simplest possible transaction, which is the transfer of money from one participant to another. So yeah, the idea is that transactions get formed by peers in this global peer-to-peer network. They get broadcast. Other peers collect these transactions into these blocks. They broadcast those blocks into the network. And then what peers in the network do, and in particular, full nodes in the network, so these are nodes who actively participate in the full maintenance of the state. What they do is they get these blocks, they get the list of transactions in the blocks, and then they replay all of these transactions in a deterministic way to get to the new state of the blockchain, right? So basically the idea is sort of in forming these blocks, the miner of these blocks sort of says, you know, this is what I think the current state is. And everyone can sort of check that they also agreed that that's the current state. And then if they're happy, they basically process all the transactions in the block, deterministically arrive at the new state. And now everyone sort of agrees on that new state. And this sort of happens every time there's a new block. All right, so if that didn't make sense, don't worry. I'll be sort of revisiting it in just a few slides. But I want to think about sort of this idea of maintaining state. And I want to imagine maintaining state for really, as I said, kind of one of the simplest possible systems, which is just keeping track of the balances of a certain set of participants and allowing them to transfer money or coins between themselves. So to do this, we're going to maintain two data structures. So I'm going to make it easier, and I'm just going to imagine that the set of participants in this system is fixed. So in particular, we've got our 4 birds here. And the first data structure we're going to consider is what I'm going to call an address tree. So this is just like a Merkle tree, where the leaves are the public keys of each of the participants in the system. Okay, so that's what that looks like. And then we're going to have another tree that we call a balance tree. And this balance tree, importantly, has all the same participants at the same indices. So the parrot is always, at the 0th index, and so on and so forth. And this balance tree is going to, instead of having a public key at the leaves, it's going to have the balance in terms of whatever unit of account we're going with. So then when we think about transactions in this simple system, we can think about, well, what's the sort of minimal amount of information you need to reveal in order to make a transfer? Well, you need to reveal the identity of the sender, the sort of identifier for the recipient, and the amount that the sender wants to send to the recipient. And then in order to make sure that, of course, the sender is actually the one authorizing this transaction and not just some random person trying to spend their money, we want this all to be signed, right? So we want to, again, make sure that it's actually the sender doing this. So if we want to check that a transaction of this form is valid, what we do is pretty simple. We can look up in the balance tree. So the sender gives us their index. We look up in that tree and see what their current balance is. And then we just check if it's more greater than or equal to the amount that they want to send. And then equally, we look up their public key in this address tree, and we verify the signature in the transaction under that public key. Okay, so that's how we can check if transactions are valid, given the sort of state of these two trees. And then in terms of processing transactions, right, in terms of actually updating the state according to the transactions, well, that's pretty simple as well. We're just going to subtract the amount being sent from the sender, and we're going to add it to the recipient. I hope that's clear. I will just go through a little example just in case. So let's imagine this transaction. So basically this represents the parrot wanting to send 2 coins to the seagull. Okay, and so they've signed this information. And so the check we're going to do to make sure that the transaction is valid is we're going to look up the balance in their index in the balance tree. And let's imagine they have 10 coins. So that is greater than or equal to 2. And then we are going to look up their public key in the address tree, and we're going to check the signature in the transaction using that public key. All right, so that's, again, the first phase of how we process, how we sort of deal with transactions is we make sure they're valid. And then assuming it's valid, the next step is going to be to process this transaction, to update the state given what the transaction says it wants to do. So for that, like I said, it's pretty simple. We just subtract 2 from the parrot's balance and we add 2 to the seagull's balance. We're not quite done though, right? Because this is like a Merkle tree. And so if we change those leaves, then we're going to sort of change everything up in the tree. And so importantly, this affects the root of this tree, right? So now we can think of the root of a Merkle tree as basically a commitment to all of its contents. And now we have this new sort of purple root that represents the new state after we've processed that one transaction. So conveniently, for where I'm going with this, we can really represent both of these phases in terms of relations, right? So we can think of, again, the roots of these trees, these hashes, as acting as a commitment to the state at the current moment. And so to check if transactions are valid, we can sort of have as the witness the full state and the list of transactions, and as the instance, the roots of both of the trees. And then we can sort of say that that instance and witness are in the relation if, you know, basically all the transactions are valid and the kind of instance and witness match up in terms of the instance hashes being the root of the witness trees. And the same is true of processing these transactions. So this R sub update relation basically captures this deterministic processing of the transactions into the tree. So we basically have the old state and the new state and the list of transactions. And we just want to prove that we've gotten from that old state to the new state by deterministically processing these transactions into the tree. All right. So let me now, like I said, sort of revisit this idea of having all these full nodes like do this processing. So let's imagine we have our blockchain. And now we have our full node, which maintains, like I said, the full state of the system, which in our case, in this example I've given, is this address and this balance tree. So like I said, in a blockchain, the way it works is peers just sort of broadcast their transactions. And so that's going to sort of start happening. And the idea is that these transactions reach a kind of special type of party that I'm going to call a relayer, represented by this raven. You can also think of this as a miner or a validator, because the way I'm presenting it, they're kind of all the same thing. So peers sort of keep broadcasting their transactions, and this relayer keeps collecting them. And then at some point, what this relayer does through this magic that I'm completely not going to talk about today, the relayer sort of turns this list of transactions into what we can call a block. And again, for the purposes of this talk, we can just think of a block as a very simple thing. It's going to have this sort of 2 hashes, the 2 roots of these trees in the header, and then it's going to have all of those transactions in the body. So what's the full node going to do when it receives this block? It's basically going to check for itself in a very direct way that these sort of instance and witness are in the relation. So when I say it's going to check that in a very direct way, I mean that it's going to construct the witness itself from its own state and from the contents of the block. It's going to construct the instance, and then it's basically just going to check that these transactions are valid. So it's going to check the conditions of the relation itself. And then it's going to do the processing itself as well. Right? So it's basically going to run through all the transactions in the block. It's going to apply them to its current state, and it's going to arrive at the new state, and then it's going to replace its state with that new state. So this is how things work in most blockchains like Bitcoin and whatever. And so the main thing to point out is that the full node here is doing work that is linear in the size of the witness here, right? It's linear in the number of transactions in the block. For every transaction in the block, it's going to check if it's valid. And if it's valid, it's going to sort of apply the updates in the tree appropriately. Okay, so now finally, I'm going to sort of bring zero-knowledge proofs into this. So let's imagine that we don't just sort of give everything out and have the full nodes do everything themselves. Let's imagine that instead what the relayer puts into the block is the new state and a proof that that new state has been derived from the old state given a set of transactions. So basically it proves knowledge of this set of transactions such that the sort of joint relation, the transactions are valid and the update has been processed correctly. It basically provides a proof of that joint relation. And now all the full node has to do is verify that proof. And if it's convinced, if the proof verifies, then basically it's proving the work that the full node was doing before. And so the full node can just replace its old state with the state that the relayer has put into the block. Conveniently, as a kind of side effect for those of you who are interested in these things, so light clients, nodes who don't want to maintain the full state, but just want to maintain the sort of commitments to it in the headers, can also perform this check, right? Because if we look at the instance here, it's just 3 hashes. And so light clients can also sort of play along and verify these proofs and sort of keep that relayer, help to keep that relayer honest. So this is, hopefully the way I've presented it, a relatively natural idea, right? Why, rather than having the full node do everything itself, why don't we just provide like a proof of knowledge? But actually this really simple idea is really popular in the cryptocurrency space at this moment. So the particular way I've presented it is sort of a simplified version of what's called a ZK rollup. But you might be sort of having some questions about this at the moment, right? So in particular, if the size of the proof here and the verifier runtime are linear in the size of the witness, then this is just as expensive as what I've presented, right? I said the full node before, when they process the transactions themselves, they do work that is linear in the number of transactions. Well, the witness is the list of transactions. And so if the size of the proof here is linear, then there's absolutely no savings at all. Right? The size of the proof on the blockchain is the same as just the list of transactions, and the work done by the full node is the same in terms of having to process everything. The other thing that's kind of weird is we actually don't care about zero knowledge at all, right? So I said this is a ZK rollup. ZK does not factor in here in any way, right? The transactions have been broadcast into the network. Everyone can see them. This new purple state anyway contains a huge amount of information. And so we actually don't care about zero knowledge at all. ZK rollups have nothing to do with zero knowledge. I will say there are some sort of interesting variants on this where we do very much care about zero knowledge, but as I've presented it, again, what I've presented is still a very popular idea, and it doesn't require zero knowledge at all. In fact, the only thing we care about is that the size of the proof is as small as possible, right? So the only reason we're using proofs is to address an issue about scalability rather than privacy or anything like that, right? So the idea is if the proofs are small, then the blockchain the blocks can be smaller. And if the full nodes can verify these proofs quickly, then basically this allows us to massively increase the throughput of the blockchain in terms of the number of transactions we can process. So very conveniently, why is this idea of a ZK rollup so popular right now? Well, this has a lot to do with how things have, the direction things have gone since Jens's sort of first result back in 2009. And this is to say that we have gone very far to the right in this graph. So, a few years after Jens's original result, we sort of saw snarks that are actually constant size. And these days, the kind of state of the art, which is again due to Jens Groth, has 3 group elements and requires 3 pairings to verify. And again, this is the size of the proof, no matter what the size of the witness is. The witness can be arbitrarily large. The proof is always going to be 3 group elements. And if I'm being honest, this is basically nearly optimal. So I don't think we should, expect to get things down too much further than this. So this seems great, if we're talking about these blockchains, if we're talking about addressing this scalability challenge, it seems like a clear win here, right? Having these small proofs, having these really, really fast verifiers is basically going to address these challenges. But of course, there are caveats, right? So these proofs do not come for free. So the first issue that I want to briefly mention is the prover runtime here is quite substantial. So if today, if you want to provide a sort of, inclusion proof in like a Merkle tree or something, I don't recommend that, honestly, for a tree of, I would say, any depth. But yeah, particularly sort of if you're getting into like trees of millions or something like that. So there has been some really interesting work recently looking at reducing these prover runtimes from, say, n log n back down to linear. And the work I just very briefly want to highlight is quite different. So I sort of want to show the breadth of techniques that are relevant to this space. So a bunch of researchers have been working on designing new hash functions that are what are called Stark or Snark friendly. So I mentioned Merkle proofs specifically because it turns out that SHA-256 and sort of other standard hash functions like that are kind of a disaster when you want to prove anything about them inside of a snark. So, when you're proving a snark, you sort of compile everything into a circuit. And yeah, SHA-256 creates a lot of constraints in that circuit. So what I've done here, just to sort of highlight what this work looks like, is I've written in Socrates a really nice proving tool, a little program for the simplest possible thing you could do, which is proving knowledge of a hash pre-image. And we can just see what I've like sort of boxed off in red there is the number of constraints that are in the resulting circuit when you compile this down. So we can see, like I said, SHA-256 is really bad. We're at almost 49,000 constraints for proving, again, knowledge of a single hash pre-image. The Petersen hash, which is an algebraic hash function, is much better, already an order of magnitude better. I guess that's maybe expected because Petersen is algebraic. But of course, the problem with using an algebraic hash function is then it's quite expensive to evaluate outside of the snark. So yeah, the one sort of hash function that, even for people working in symmetric crypto, which can often seem quite far from this space, there is a lot of opportunity here. And of course, I'm not recommending that anyone rush out and start using Poseidon in their production system. We still need a lot of work to convince ourselves that these hash functions are secure. But it's certainly really, really promising. So the other big downside that I am going to spend quite a bit more time getting into is going back to this sort of definition that I presented where non-interactive zero-knowledge proofs require a common reference string. And so this is somewhat an artifact of the constructions we have ish, but basically the known constructions we have for constant size snarks require one of these structured reference strings. And that means, if you remember, that we require what's called a trusted setup. So I'm going to sort of explain why this requires a trusted setup. And I'm also going to go through basically all of the different ways that we can imagine generating the reference string. So first, let's start with this trusted setup. So basically, the idea is, okay, let's just have a single party run the setup algorithm and generate the structured reference string. What's wrong with that? Well, again, this is somewhat an artifact of the proving systems that we have today, but a lot of them are perfect zero knowledge, which basically means that the setup is identical to the simulation setup. And so what that means is that this party is essentially running the simulation setup algorithm, which outputs not only the structured reference string, but also one of these simulation trapdoors. Okay, so I've just put a sort of example of such a structured reference string here, showing sort of, yeah, the trapdoor here would be this exponent alpha. And if you remember how the simulator works, well, if someone can act as the simulator, then they can prove things without knowing the witness. And what that means is that really they can provide proofs of false statements. So that should already be kind of worrying. We don't really want parties in our system who can just like prove false things. If we now consider like a cryptocurrency setting like Zcash, which actually does use zero knowledge proofs, then this becomes even more disastrous because this party would actually be quite financially incentivized to provide proofs of false statements, because doing so would allow them to spend money that they don't have, right? So in Zcash, you basically prove in ZeroKnowledge that you have certain coins. And if you can fake that proof, then you can just prove that you have coins without actually having coins, and then you can spend them. So this is sort of why we say that this is a trusted process, because essentially you're also generating this simulation trapdoor. And I hope it's pretty clear that certainly in cryptocurrencies, but really in any real system, this is pretty unrealistic, right? There's no, what we're relying on is for that trusted party to throw away the trapdoor when they generate it. So there's no way for them to like prove that they did that, right? They can't prove the absence of this like randomness, you know, sitting on some hard drive somewhere. So that's unfortunate. So now let's move on and try to consider essentially the complete opposite end of the spectrum, which is this idea of allowing the adversary to completely subvert the reference string generation process. So this is a really strong notion. This was considered first by Valery Fuchs-Baron-Scaforo, Eurocrypt 2016. And let's sort of look at what soundness and ZeroKnowledge look like with this idea of subversion. To be honest, it's really not so different from the normal definitions, at least for the purposes of my talk. So basically, subversion soundness just says that the prover can't prove false statements, even if it actually generated the reference string entirely by itself. And equally, subversion ZeroKnowledge basically says that, well, ZeroKnowledge holds even if the verifier, the malicious verifier, generated this structured reference string entirely by themselves. So these are pretty strong notions. And so it shouldn't really surprise anyone that one of their main results in this first paper was an impossibility result. So they do have some positive results showing that kind of weaker notions of subversion properties can be achieved together, like witness indistinguishability rather than ZeroKnowledge. But the kind of important result for us in this space is that they basically showed that subversion soundness cannot be achieved at the same time as regular ZeroKnowledge. So that basically tells us that what we'd like to be able to do is actually impossible. So that's too bad. So the next option is we can consider what's called a fully transparent setup. So this basically says that rather than generating one of these structured reference strings, why don't we generate one of these uniform reference strings, right? So just like uniformly random numbers, or we could think of it even more simply as just the description of a hash function or something like that, right? So this is great. This is sort of the gold standard for setup, right? Like the adversary can generate it entirely itself. We don't care because there's nothing they can do in generating the reference string that would allow them, give them any advantage in breaking soundness or ZeroKnowledge or anything. So this is a really compelling idea. This is an entire sort of area of research called STARKS. So the T here stands for transparent. And like I said, this is pretty much exactly what we would hope for. So we don't have to worry about setup. A lot of these constructions are based on collision resistant hash functions. So they're at least sort of plausibly post-quantum secure, as compared, I should say, with all these snark constructions, which are based on pairings. So there's sort of one downside here, I guess. Actually, I'll say the main reason I'm not going to cover STARKs too much in this talk is because I don't have time. So, you know, that's like a whole nother hour to get into STARKs and all the techniques that are used there. Yeah, so the only downside I'll mention here really is that as compared with all of these snark constructions, STARKs are bigger. Basically, we don't have any constructions that are as efficient as, say, the Grot 16 snark or anything like that. So yeah, if you're willing to have your proof be like logarithmic or polylog in the size of the witness, then and you know have your verifier take a little longer as well, then a STARK is definitely kind of the way to go, I would say. But if you're really focused on efficiency, then in some sense, at least for now, you're sort of stuck with these snarks. So the last thing I'll explore is basically, okay, we can try to sort of take that really unrealistic trusted setup and just sort of distribute that trust by generating the reference string using a multi-party computation. So this is also research that has definitely been explored. Researchers have developed, you know, very highly optimized MPC protocols, both in terms of the sort of computational efficiency of the participants, but also the ability to scale to many participants. And maybe unsurprisingly, given that Grot16 is the most efficient snark, a lot of that research has focused on MPC protocols for generating the specific structured reference string that is used by Grot16. This isn't just research. These protocols have actually been run in practice by a bunch of different projects. The way they are run is, I think, highly performative. If you're not familiar with this idea of a trusted setup ceremony, it is genuinely very ceremonial. I would encourage you to, just Google it and look at some of the articles that people have written about some of the ceremonies, in particular, the first sort of Zcash ceremony. But there's one sort of caveat that I haven't mentioned yet, which is for Grot16 and for, in fact, most of these constant size snarks, the structured reference string is not universal. So remember, that means that it can only be used to prove a specific relation. And this might not sound so bad. You could say, okay, but just prove the same relation like for your system. But if you're a software developer and you're putting a system out into the world, you want to be able to patch it. You want to be able to add new functionalities, add new features. And so it's not great to just say, oh, every time you want to do that, every time you want to patch or upgrade, you just have to run another of these like insanely complicated trusted setup ceremonies, right? So Zcash has actually done that. Zcash has run to date 2 of these trusted setup ceremonies, but you certainly don't want to be doing it too often. So there was sort of a compromise that I developed with my co-authors, Jens Grot-Markov-Kulweis, Mary Maller, and Ian Myers. This was a paper we first published in Crypto 2018. And this is a sort of, like I said, a bit of a compromise between subversion and trusted setup that we called updateability. So the idea of updateability is that we have a party, and this party has some randomness that is basically the trapdoor. And they use that randomness to generate a structured reference string. And importantly, we really only want to consider universal structured reference strings. I should say you can always derive circuit-specific structured reference strings from this kind of universal one. But really, we want something that's going to allow you to prove many different relations. And then the other thing that this party is going to do is they're going to prove that this structured reference string, they're going to basically prove knowledge of the randomness that was used to form this structured reference string. Okay, and importantly, this proof is quite lightweight. It doesn't require its own structured reference string. So this isn't like some recursive like chicken or egg thing. This is a lightweight proof that can just be publicly verified. So this right now is a trusted setup, right? We like this party completely knows the trapdoor. They completely know all the randomness that went into the structured reference string. But the idea is that we can update it. So now we have another party come along. That party can take in the original structured reference string. They can take in their own randomness, and they can basically fold that randomness into the structured reference string. They can basically re-randomize the structured reference string, adding in their own randomness. And then again, they just form a proof that they've done that correctly. Okay, so that the structured reference string still has the right structure, but just adds their new randomness. And basically, we can just continue this process. And the idea is that sort of at the end of what I've put on my slide here, this 5th reference string, the trap door behind it, the randomness in it, is some combination of the randomness of all of these parties. And so as long as at least one of these parties is honest, no one is going to know that trap door. Okay, so no one is going to be able to act as the simulator and form proofs of false statements. So as long as at least one party just sort of threw their randomness away as they were supposed to do, or at least just didn't share it with the others, no one knows it. So you might say, okay, well, fine, but I mean, that's actually the same like guarantee that you would get from one of these MPC protocols anyway. And so I would say the difference here is that this process doesn't have an end, right? An MPC is sort of like you run it and then it's done, and that's the structured reference string. And if you want to do anything else, you have to run it all over again. So here, the set of parties is not fixed. If at any point in time someone has a problem with this structured reference string, if they don't trust it, then they can just contribute to it themselves. They can add their own randomness. And as long as they trust themselves, then now basically they'll be convinced at least that this structured reference string is good and that no one party knows the trapdoor for it. So what we presented in this crypto paper was a kind of very much a feasibility result. And we sort of followed that up with a paper in 2019, again, with Markov and Mary, and also with Sean Bove, where we presented a sort of practical, updatable, and universal snark called Sonic. And so the last thing I want to sort of say about updatability is, how do we imagine using something like this in practice, right? You might look at the sequential nature of this and say, well, that doesn't seem great. And, anyway, who's going to be sort of doing this, right? And so that's a very valid question in an application in general. But actually, for this particular setting of blockchains, it's a really great fit, it turns out. So the idea is, in my mind at least, the idea is you can start with a multi-party computation. You can generate a sort of, initial structured reference string that way. And of course, that already might be good enough, if, again, at least one of these parties was honest. But why don't we just keep going? So how about we imagine that every time a miner generates a block, they just do this process, okay? So they take some randomness, they fold it into the structured reference string, they provide a proof that they've done that, and then they put that proof into their block, whether it's actually the header or the body or whatever, we don't care. And then the idea is that, the next miner does this. And of course, this doesn't have to be every block. It could be every 10 blocks, every 100 blocks. We really don't care. The idea is that miners can sort of do this as they go. Miners are already doing a lot of work to support the cryptocurrency. So this is, really nothing extra for them. And then again, these proofs are really lightweight to verify. So a full node or any node interested in actually using a reference string and proving something can sort of verify this series of update proofs, and then they can use that latest structured reference string. So this sort of, again, this sequential nature really nicely fits this sequential nature of blockchains. And the last thing I'll say is that it's also, I think, a quite nice fit because it definitely doesn't add any assumptions, right? So remember, the requirement we needed for updatability was that at least one of these parties is honest. Well, the requirements we need for a blockchain they're much stronger than that, right? If we basically need an honest majority of miners rather than just one honest miner. And so in particular, we're not making any new assumptions here at all. Everything we want is already guaranteed or hopefully is already in place for the whole blockchain to work in the first place. So kind of where I've been going with all of this is that, I'm certainly not claiming I should say any kind of causation like, oh, the existence of blockchains has meant that we did all this work on zero knowledge. I also don't think it's hurt though. I think it's a really nice application. People in this space, practitioners, are incredibly excited about this. Lots of the protocols that I've presented have, been deployed within 1 year or something crazy like that of being published. But no matter how we got there, basically the situation today is we have this sort of, whole like beautiful rainbow of candidate zero knowledge proof constructions. So we can see we have them across a variety of algebraic settings. We have a lot of different trade-offs, of course, that aren't all captured on this slide. And by the way, I do want to say thanks to Jonathan Boodle for generously lending me the original version of this slide. Something I do want to mention, which I think is really exciting, is that in the past year, we've started to see constructions that sort of abstract the techniques that are used in a lot of these individual constructions and sort of create generic zero knowledge proofs that can then be instantiated in a variety of different settings, right? So there's not just sort of ones that are inherently lattice-based or inherently pairing-based. Depending on how we sort of instantiate different components, we can get the sort of same framework applying to a lot of them. Okay, so in my remaining sort of few minutes, I want to now just switch gears completely and talk about a really different computational setting. So the setting I want to look at is something that I claim happens sort of all the time in the world around us. And this is this idea of privately aggregating computation. So computing private aggregate statistics. So the idea is we have a lot of users, and then we have an aggregator in the center here, this albatross. So we want this to be private. So all these users have some kind of input, and we want the system to be private. So we sort of have the users send this aggregator some hiding representation of their input. And then the job of the aggregator is to somehow compute the sort of aggregate function over all of these inputs. Right, so whatever function it may be. Again, this is pretty abstract for now. Let me give sort of one concrete example, I guess, actually, before I change slides, which is we could think of one example as being voting. Okay, so in voting, we could think of each user's input as being their vote. Say it's a referendum, and so their vote is just a single bit, yes or no. We can think of this hiding representation as being, an encryption or something like that of their vote. And then we can think of the job of the aggregator as being the job of tallying the results of the election, right? So the aggregator wants to see how many people voted yes. So that's just sort of really one of many applications. So hopefully that sort of gave at least some idea of what we're talking about. Other applications, so some of my colleagues at Google have kind of used this setup to basically train machine learning models. So this is a protocol called SecAg. You can also imagine really just computing really any statistics. So if you're a browser vendor, you could compute, what's the most popular homepage for users. If you're, run like fitness tracking devices, you could determine, what's the most popular place in this city to go for a run or something like that, right? So just all these sort of aggregate statistics which are really useful for these companies, but which we want to be private, right? We don't want, so I should say, of course, when you're doing these kinds of things, you definitely need like strong differential privacy guarantees. You don't want this aggregate statistic to reveal anything about any one user's behavior. So in addition to sort of the users sending this sort of private, sort of obscured input, it's also pretty important that they send a proof that their input has the right form, right? So for a vote, for example, if they don't do this and someone's voting in a referendum and they're really, really in support of whatever is being voted on, then they're just going to encrypt like 1 million instead of 1 or 0, which is what they're supposed to do, right? So in voting, we would want this to come along with a proof that this, hidden value is a bit. More generally, again, if we think about any kind of statistics, this could be like a k-hot vector, a 1-hot vector, any kind of form that we want this input to have. So now we're talking about not only sending this input from the users to the aggregator, we're also talking about sending a proof. And then, of course, the aggregator is going to have to verify that all these proofs are valid before it performs this aggregation. If we think about voting systems or fitness tracking or any of these kinds of things, we're talking about a lot of users, right? We might have like millions or tens of millions of users. So of course, if we think about our constraints, well, we want the proofs to be small and we want verification to be fast. And so you might say, okay, great, whatever, just use a snark. I'm sure that's what you're going to say, but that's not at all what I'm going to say, right? Because the other big constraint we have in this kind of system is our users, right? So users might be running a laptop. They might have a pretty good laptop, or increasingly, if we're talking about browsing, say, users might be on mobile devices. If we're talking about fitness tracking, users might be using, like the user might be like a smartwatch or an even more constrained device than that. And so actually, snarks are completely inapplicable here because the prover runtime is really our biggest constraint, and prover runtimes and snarks are high. Okay, so currently I would say doing this in kind of the way I've presented it is in some sense very much an open problem. Obviously, for a given application, you're just going to try to find an applicable proof system and optimize it as much as you possibly can. But I just want to, again, highlight some work that has gone in a slightly different direction. And this is this idea of what's called a distributed zero-knowledge proof. So the idea is, what sort of trick are we going to use to make this cheaper? Well, rather than have the prover interact with one verifier, the aggregator, we're going to have them interact with 2. That doesn't sound like it should be cheaper, right? It just sounds like now everyone's going to have to do twice as much work. So the prover sort of sends 2 bits of information, 1 to each aggregator. And now the aggregators are going to have to jointly verify this proof and make sure their input is valid before jointly doing this aggregation. So you could say that doesn't sound good at all. But the idea is that by sort of splitting these inputs across these aggregators, we can use much cheaper methods of sort of hiding the prover's input than, say, public key encryption or something like that. So in particular, we can think of each bit of information that the prover sends to each aggregator as just a secret share of their input, rather than, again, some kind of encryption or some kind of other hidden piece of information about it. And secret sharing is really just much cheaper, basically. So yeah, don't have time for any details here. I'll mention that the first sort of consideration of this was in a paper by Henry Corrigan Gibbs and Dan Bonnet called Prio. And of course, I should say there's a very important assumption that's also being made here, which is that the verifiers cannot be colluding, right? So of course, if the prover sends them each a secret share of their input and they collude, then they just put the secret shares together and they get the prover's input and zero knowledge is completely destroyed. So yeah, it's a very strong assumption that these provers aren't colluding, but it allows us to make hugely more efficient systems. So we can actually do this with lower computation for both the prover and the verifier, basically just doing like multiplications rather than exponentiations or pairings. And we can also do this with constant communication between the two verifiers. So again, that means even if the prover's input is really, really big, like an enormously long vector, we can still have constant communication between those verifiers. And despite this strong assumption, this kind of work has actually been deployed. So for those of you who sort of may have looked into it, this is actually sort of what was used by Apple and Google in the exposure notification system that they sort of deployed during the pandemic. It's also been sort of, Mozilla is experimenting with using Prio for telemetry data in their Firefox browser. And the ISRG, the Internet Security Research Group, which runs the Let's Encrypt browser, Let's Encrypt Certificate Authority, also now offers basically running Prio as a service. So basically they say, hey, if you want to stand up one of these sort of aggregate statistic things, you know, we'll, if you pay us, basically we'll run the other server for you and we won't collude. Okay, so just to wrap up, I hope I've convinced you that even if it's not fun and exciting, it's certainly an active area of research. And I think in particular, we're in this really sort of virtuous cycle at the moment, where basically the more and more practical zero knowledge proofs become, the more and more attention they attract from practitioners. So the more people are sort of saying, hey, maybe I could use zero knowledge proofs in my application. And that actually in turn also leads to more practical proofs itself, right? Because the more we can sort of customize constructions for these proofs, whether that's like literally doing the algebraic manipulations to sort of, and these optimizations, but also sort of, again, coming up with these new models like, you know, updateability or like this idea of a distributed zero knowledge proof. So I hope I've convinced you that, you know, there is a lot going on. There's a lot to do. There's a lot of different sort of expertise that can be useful here, whether it's, you know, in symmetric crypto, designing some of these new hash functions, designing sort of more snark and start friendly data structures. Again, Merkle trees are tough right now, whether it's modeling, working on the techniques. Yeah, and that's it. So thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
Hi, you said that in DFS 16, they showed that the first subversion idea was not compatible with zero knowledge. As in the blockchains, you don't necessarily want that. If you do it and not get the zero knowledge you don't want.
Well, so I'd say zero knowledge is quite important in a blockchain setting, and in particular, perfect zero knowledge is quite important because this data is on a globally visible ledger. It's going to be there forever. So if we had anything other than perfect zero knowledge, then at some point in the future, we could basically imagine breaking zero knowledge and having someone learn everyone's data from, you know, 10 years ago. And so that would be pretty bad.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
We cannot hear the moderator.
Okay, so the question is, you mentioned federated learning as application. Are there any techniques here for protection of code versus data?
Protection of, okay, I'm not sure what that question means, if I'm being honest, but obviously the idea of protecting the data is yeah, how you protect it, right? Like I said, the users should always send their data in some hidden form. And so that is sort of what hides the data. And then of course, if the proof is zero knowledge, then the proof is also not going to reveal anything about the data. So that's probably the best I can answer the question.
This one? Yeah, let's go. Thanks for the great talk. I have one question about this case that you said 1 year updates the server families. So can we aggregate these all groups, or because if a new one comes to the network but it does not check the previous one groups, so can we aggregate these groups and then we will have just one group?
Can you please repeat the question? We can't hear it.
Sure. Sorry. The question was if we can aggregate these update proofs or if they need to be individual. I'm 90% sure we cannot aggregate them. Mary is not so sure. I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say either way, you know, like the full nodes, and like if we put this in the header, then even light clients are like always processing the header. So it's in some sense like they're processing, like they get it all in sequentially and they keep the whole header. So aggregating the proofs is I guess not like the most important thing I would say in that particular setting. But yeah, I cannot say off the top of my head if it's actually possible or not.
So the guarantee was that as long as there is one of this party, the intermediate lifetime is right. But if the party updates that criteria is a malicious party, then you can XOR out the randomness of everyone.
No, because they don't know I mean, it's not actually XOR, I should say. I just put that as a generic.
Yeah, I mean, any malleable system can be XOR, and for example, even if the Trapdoor is secret, it doesn't imply that it's not malleable. So under the hood of the commitment, let's say you can XOR out the randomness.
Okay, so I'm not completely sure I understood, but yeah, the answer is the last party can't do that. So yeah, they can't get rid of the randomness of the other contributors because they don't know it. So there's no way for them, like if you think about the structured reference string I showed, which was like G to the alpha squared and so on and so forth, there's no way to just like replace, yeah, like the proof wouldn't, like the update proof wouldn't go through basically. There's no way to just have a valid proof, a valid update proof, but like have just like replaced the alpha with beta or something like that.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting talk. And connect to the same topic with this updateability thing again, multi-party stuff. So this chain, there is a chain of tuples that you cannot go back if you trust at least one party to be honest, right?
Mm-hmm.
But is there an incentive to be honest in the situation, whereas in a, like, what's your incentive to be the one to be honest? And also, yes, so why should I trust at least another one as a prisoner's dilemma thing, kind of, and also afterwards, is there a way, like meta info information point of view, to enforce, to prove the public trustfulness so that every party trusts the trustfulness of the full chain, or there isn't, I don't know, maybe.
Okay, I'll get as far as I can. So just to repeat the question, which was great, I should say, why should we trust any of these parties to be honest? And is there a sort of public way to check? So like I said, there's no way for anyone to prove that they threw away their own randomness. So the best we can do in terms of public verification is checking the sequence of update proofs, which, like I said, they're publicly verifiable. Anyone with access to, say, the headers of the blockchain or something can do that. And the answer to your first question is, yeah, this is a a human problem at this point, right? Like you said, like this is not something we can solve cryptographically. I will say, so the first Zcash ceremony was performed by 6 participants. And, you know, some of the participants were the creators of Zcash and people who were very heavily invested in the success of Zcash. And yeah, I mean, at some point you could say, well, who's more incentivized to, you know, make this a successful, trustworthy system than them? So you know, the weight of that answer sort of depends on you, I guess. You know, it's not necessarily completely convincing, but and I should say, by the way, again, these ceremonies are highly performative. One of them was like on a plane with like radioactive waste from Chernobyl, like using that to generate their randomness and then like have it decay, like, I don't know, crazy stuff. So, you know, at some point, and you know, they all film themselves the whole time that they're doing this. So like I said, if you haven't sort of seen anything about this, go look into it. But ultimately, yeah, this is very much like a human question rather than something we could ever solve cryptographically.
Thank you.
There is a question in Zoom. Would you like to unmute yourself to ask the question, Shuanghu?
Yes. Dear Dr. Meiklejohn, may I ask whether the cost for generating common reference string using MPC protocol is practical?
So I think the question was, what's the cost of the MPC? And yeah, I mean, it's still relatively costly. So the first ceremony was like over a period of days with many hours of computation. The second one was more scalable in the sense that it had more participants, but it was still a good bit of computation. So yeah, it's definitely not a light process as compared with, say, the updating, which is much, much cheaper.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for the talk. I want to ask you a question about, so in theory, a lot of the security that relies on modeling the hash functions around Oracle. And I guess in practice, a lot of these optimizations work by instantiating this random Oracle concrete hash function, which has specific optimization, which is even further from random. And what is the consensus like? How do researchers in the area feel about it?
Well, that's a great question. And I'm just going to completely parrot Mary, who some of you may have heard present this problem on Sunday.
Please repeat the question. We cannot hear the questions because they're not using a microphone that goes into Zoom.
Okay, so yeah, the question was a lot of these constant size snarks, or a lot of snarks in general, are secure in the random Oracle model. So what does this sort of mean for them when we're talking about using instantiating these random oracles as actual hash functions? So I started to say that, yeah, I'm just going to completely sort of echo what Mary said for those of you who were in the workshop on Sunday, which is, yes, this is actually a problem in practice. I only learned this from Mary. It actually affects our ability to use these proofs, having them be in the random Oracle model. So aside from the sort of theoretical interest of having proofs that don't rely on the random Oracle model, this is actually a practical implication as well. And it's a really great open problem. So that's all I can say is, yeah, it does matter in practice as well as a sort of theoretical result. But basically, yeah, having universal snarks with proofs of security outside of the random Oracle model would be great. And hopefully we'll see that soon.
One question about the public computation application. So in this case, like runtime is the main constraint, or it can be the main constraint. So I want to ask whether it's clear whether the non-interactive proofs are still the right trade-off, because in case of, say, the voting application or something, it seems like an interactive proof as well.
Yeah, it's, sorry, the question was, in this private aggregate computation setting, is it clear that non-interactive zero-knowledge proofs are the way to go, given that proof of runtime is such a big constraint? That's a great question. I would say that the answer is no, it's not at all clear. Ultimately, this is a very broad area, right? And the way to really solve things is to look at specific use cases, where people want to do it, exactly what their constraints are. And then, like I said, just try to come up with the right zero-knowledge proof for the job. And I think by no means is it clear that, NISICs are just are the best way to go. I think some level of interaction, if it means that proof of runtime can be cheaper, is absolutely on the table when you're kind of having those discussions.
So thanks a lot for the talk. It's a good time to close the session and go for lunch.